All right, so we finished this. We've put 2 coats on here. We're ready to kind of do our edges. And I mentioned using a sponge before. The beautiful part about using a sponge rather than sanding, when you sand, you make an awful lot of dust. When you use a sponge, there is no dust. And what it'll do is on these little edges where you're feathering in to the existing texture, it actually will clean the sharp edges off and make it match into the texture. Now this sponge that I'm using, you have sponge on one side and it's a little abrasive on the other side. This is typically used for doing tile work, grout and such, but it works great for doing sheetrock too. See how quick that's coming off of there? So I'll use the sponge side to get it a little moist, and that softens it up, and then I can use the abrasive side to match it in to the texture. All right, we're getting ready to do the texturing now. We've got actually 2 different type of textures here though. The ceiling has basically a heavy orange peel, and the wall has a mix of stomp and drag. It's not a true stomp and drag, but more or less that's what it is. So we're going to start with the ceiling because then we can scrape off whatever sprays onto the wall prior to doing it. So since we got just a small space to do here, I'm just going to use one of these cans. Now you can practice on a piece of sheetrock prior to coming out and actually trying your thing. One of the key things is to make sure you shake these things up good, because it's going to have a mixture inside the can that, if it's not mixed well, it's just going to be just water coming out. So, and when you're putting it on, you want to go in a circular motion. You know, our tendency is to try to go back and forth, and it just doesn't come out right that way. You tend to get streaks instead. So, now it may look like I'm going heavy, but we're going to stomp and drag on. We're going to drag on this in just a minute. We're going to let that sit for just a second before we drag it. While we're letting it sit, let's clean up the little bit of overspray we have, so we're ready to go on our walls here in just a minute as well, because there's no reason to have to wait for that ceiling to dry all the way. Now we're just going to take our clean wide knife and do a very, very light drag across. You notice I'm a little heavier here, a little lighter there. We can actually go back and add a little bit. And that is where we're going to leave this one. Now, you're going to want to make sure to do 2 coats of primer before painting, because anytime you do sheetrock work, it dries the paint out, and you're going to use a primer sealer in order to seal it up so it doesn't just suck all the moisture out of the paint. On a flat ceiling, it's not as critical, but on the walls where you got a semi-gloss, that's where it becomes critical to make sure you seal it well so that it's not just sucking up all the paint. Now we're going to go ahead and do our wall as well. We're going to get our sponge back out, and literally we're just going to dab on some of the mud on here, and same thing, we're just going to pat it on, and we're always overlapping into the areas that we didn't work so that we can blend stuff together. Now this has a troweled finish on it, and so we're going to go back with our 6-inch knife, because you can see the patterns in the rest of it, and it's literally just kind of a cut and drag on it. It's not a super hard finish, but when you're trying to match what somebody else did, it can be rather difficult at times. And I I think we can blend in with that. It's really that simple. The thing is, yes, it stands out right now. What you got to remember is as sheetrock mud dries, it shrinks. So what's really high right now is actually going to shrink down some. And if it doesn't get as low as you want it, use that sponge again to take off some of the surface, and you can get it down to the height that you want. Prime it, paint it, and you're finished.